Well, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here and introducing this wonderful new series, The Architecture of Place, collaboration between the ICAA, Ifugao, and the Princess Foundation. This series of talks is a collaboration between these three organizations and focuses on the built environment and its impact on the health of individuals, communities, and the planet. Established and emerging voices will speak on their work to create a better built future, something we can all look forward to. Today's talk is entitled Design by Radical Indigenism. Our speaker, Julia Watson, will speak on the concept of low tech, T-E-K in capitals, derived from traditional ecological knowledge. Low tech is a cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs, countering the idea that indigenous innovation is primitive and exists isolated from technology. It is sophisticated and designed to sustainably work with complex ecosystems. Julia will discuss her research into the thousands of years of human wisdom and ingenuity from places like Peru, the Philippines, Tanzania, Kenya, Iran, Iraq, India, and Indonesia in order to recover an ancient mythology in contemporary context, radicalizing the spirit of human nature. Landscape designer and educator, Julia Watson is a leading expert on indigenous technologies. Her best-selling book, Low Tech, Designed by Radical Indigenism, has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, Monocle, Architectural Digest, and more. Regularly teaching at Harvard and Columbia universities, Julia's studio work involves landscape and urban design, along with public speaking and consulting with brands on sustainability. In her studio, she collaborates with Marie Salambier with a focus on rewilding and has just completed the summer gardens for Rockefeller Center using a native plant pellet inspired by the American meadow. I introduce to you Julia Watson.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much to Ifugao, to the ICAA, and also to the Princess Foundation for this invitation to speak with you all here today. But first, before we begin the lecture, I just wanted to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional land of the first people of Brooklyn, New York. They're the Lenape people, and I honor with them their past and present and give gratitude to the land and to the Lenape. So in a story that's really becoming all too familiar around the globe, earlier this year, very large parts of my country, Australia, with the worst wildfires that we'd ever seen, and they were caused by drought and by delayed rains and by underfunded prevention, but also by these centuries-old bans on cultural burning practices. But in the midst of all this catastrophe, something really interesting happened. What we saw was that the ancestral lands that practice something called cultural burning, it's also known as fire stick farming, they were actually fine as these wildfires just raged around them. And here I'm showing you an image on the screen that it's an image of a man, Victor Stephenson. He's an Indigenous writer, he's a filmmaker, he's a consultant. He's here actually teaching Aboriginal fire knowledge at an Indigenous fire workshop. And this image is courtesy of the Fire Stick Alliance. They're a community organization in Australia that works to teach and share knowledge about cultural burning practices. And Indigenous pyrotechnology, it has evolved over millennia, and it actually cut down the impact of the wildfires that we saw by half. And here in this image, what you can see is the burning of gum tree country ecosystem, and it all happens at very specific times. And these trees, they survived because of these practices of slow burning. And those practices are guided by something called traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and that's passed down through generations. And so more recently, what we actually saw was similar wildfires. We saw them across the globe, but we also saw them really raging across the American West. And they had a similar ferocity to what we'd seen earlier this year in Australia. And well, we understand that wildfires, they have been part of ecosystems for millennia, for thousands of years. And some ecosystems actually need wildfires to regenerate. They're a global phenomenon, but they're also now an indicator for us of climate change. And we know now that they're a man-made disaster because we have pyrotechnology practices that we know can prevent them. And so that's what low tech proposes. This is a book that I wrote earlier this year, and I began it in 2012 while I was working on a sacred landscape, a landscape master plan to conserve a sacred landscape, which was Bali's first UNESCO World Heritage site. And this was a project with the Indonesian government, and it was a project to conserve 40,000 acres of sacred rice terraces, which are a very advanced technology. But while the book began in 2012, this research actually began a lot earlier. And it actually began in my second year of architecture. So before I became a landscape architect and started teaching, I actually studied architecture. And in my second year of architecture in Australia, I did a seminar, and it was called Aboriginal Environments. And interestingly, this is a core seminar taught by Dr. Paul Memmott, who's an anthropologist as an architect back in Brisbane in Australia. And it was a compulsory seminar for every single architecture student. And it was through that seminar that I really came to understand architecture in the built environment in a different way that saw humans and nature working together, symbiotically. So for example, this image here, this is one of the images that is one of the most memorable images from that seminar. It's actually the oldest human-made structure on Earth, and it dates back 40,000 years. It's called the Brearina Fish Traps, and it's about a third of a mile long, and it sits on the bend of the river where the town of Brearina now sits. And it's this large natural rock bar, and it's got these series of small and large rock pools which divert water and then inevitably fish into these series of pools that can be hand fished. And then once the fish are trapped, they're very easy to collect and collect sustainably as well. And so taking a little trip down memory lane here to sort of take you through what led me into this research, I want to just discuss, so after architecture school and after doing that course, which really sort of changed the trajectory of how I thought about architecture in the built environment, I went on to study landscape architecture, and I was really interested in researching an Indigenous community that was having a lot of issues with their government over in Malaysia, and this community are called the Penan people. And I was very interested in the work of this person in the center of this image. His name is Bruno Manzer. He was a Swiss environmentalist. He was assisting this indigenous forest dwelling community called the Penan people to really stand up against their government. They were being displaced and they were losing their land and their ecosystems to forestry and logging. And Manzer actually, during the course of my studying him at the time, he actually went missing. He was presumed murdered by mercenaries from the government. A year later, after I finished postgraduate landscape architecture, I left Australia, actually destined for the UK, as many Australians do when they're young, but I went via Borneo. And it was in Borneo that I actually went to visit one of the Penan communities. They had gone from being a nomadic community to a very sedentary community. They had been displaced and put in government encampments where their migration and their lifestyle had been very limited. They were removed from their lands. And I went and photographed and stayed and spoke to the people here, photographing the children using very traditional hunting instruments in the environments that they now were living in. And it was really through this trip that I came to understand the profound ignorance through which many nature-based cultures and their technologies are viewed by the dominant models of government and progress and development in which they actually find themselves forced to exist. And so that trip really began my research into the many different concepts that I've been exploring by traveling the world and writing and researching. And it's always been under this suspicion that perhaps most of our sustainable technologies and innovations, they're actually rooted in cultures and in knowledge that was figured out a millennia ago. And so scientists have now acknowledged that we're in the midst of the sixth great mass extinction. But what we haven't really understood is this, and that species alone will not be the 21st century's greatest loss. Those same forces that drive the species extinction, they endanger indigenous communities and technologies and natural ecosystems. But what's not realized is the nature-based solutions and technologies that are not even recognized as technologies that may hold a key to survival. And these are technologies that have been evolved and passed down through generations in response to exactly the same conditions that we're dealing with today. So flooding and fire, drought, sea level rise, severe weather events. And these technologies, they're actually incredibly well adapted to their environments. And in fact, they play a key role in conserving the biodiversity of these landscapes. And so what seems to me so strange is that when we talk about climate change solutions, which inevitably and really fortuitously, we are talking about this so much more today, we're still thinking on the grounds of conservation most of the time. These pristine and undeveloped and often already conserved wetlands and forests and desert and mountain landscapes, and often landscapes where communities have been removed from those landscapes. And rather than considering that there are thousands of ways that local communities have adapted and developed landscapes and ecosystems and progressed with incredibly resilient and sophisticated technologies that are often more advanced than some of the design thinking that we're employing today. Like this community, this is an image of the Tafino people. They live on a lake in Benin in West Africa. This particular community feeds 1 million people that live around them. And what you can see in this image, all these squares around these houses which are on stilts, they're fish traps, and there are 12,000 of these constructed fish traps that are on this lake. So an ideal condition for creating these fish traps, which actually create an artificial reef environment to trap tilapia. So as mentioned in the introduction today, now I'm an author and a landscape and urban designer, and I consult for global corporations on how to think of alternative futures and innovations. And I teach and recently wrote this book that was published by Tushin. And I want to explain the title because it's not an obvious title. It's a word that I made up. It's a combination of two words, local and TEK. And it makes sense when you actually look at the material in the book, but what most people aren't aware of is it's actually a provocation. It's poking fun at the inherited and views and biases towards local cultures and their technologies, because mistakenly, these technologies, they're often referred to as low-tech, as you can see written here, LOWTECH. And low-tech systems, if you're familiar with these types of systems, they're actually talked about as unsophisticated and primitive, and they come from industrial manufacturing. And that's very different to the types of systems that are being looked at in this book, and the types of systems that contain traditional ecological knowledge. Because the types of systems that are in low-tech evolved with traditional ecological knowledge are actually incredibly sophisticated. They embody all of today's sustainability principles, like low embodied energy and low impact and low cost, and forming closed loop systems. And so the second part of the word TEK, TEK is traditional ecological knowledge, and that's defined as the foundational cumulative body of multi-generational knowledge, practices, and beliefs. And that's really what's being discussed in the book that I wrote. And TEK can be understood in a lot of different ways, but sometimes it's represented like this to give you a sort of broader understanding. It's talked about as a system of nested concepts that explain the construction of the world around an individual. And that includes one's local knowledge of their lands and ecosystems and animals. And then underneath that, the land and resource management systems that are employed. And then beneath that, the social institutions that one interacts with, say Infugao or the ICAA. And then contained underneath that is all the worldviews or the belief systems of that particular individual. And then the byline for the book is Design by Radical Indigenism. And so this concept of radical indigenism, that is a philosophy of Professor Eva Marie Garut. She is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and she argues for a rebuilding of knowledge through explorations of indigenous philosophies that are capable of then generating new knowledge and new dialogues for indigenous communities. And in low tech, I've been talking about these ideas specifically applied to design and sustainability, and extending this idea, arguing for a new look at Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous science and design and technologies to inform sustainability and resilience thinking. And so low tech is a movement to rebuild an understanding of local knowledge, technology, and vernacular design to generate sustainable, climate resilient infrastructures. And so I want to just go back to where I had mentioned when I first started writing low tech, which is in 2012. And I was teaching a seminar at Columbia University, actually this first seminar that I ever taught, and it was called Landscape Ecotechnology. And this seminar, it looked mostly at high-tech solutions, but the solutions that were being talked about and applied to the built environment at the time. There's an example of one of my students' work, and it's a bridge that cleans water, and it's infused with water quality indicating piezoelectric lights. It's carbon nanotube sponges that absorb oil and it retains buoyancy, has oysters to filter the water as it passes through under the bridge. It was a brilliant design. In fact, I still get professors who are at the final review of this design coming up to me today and saying, remember that design that your students did? That bog bridge, that was incredible. So this is 8 years ago. It was a really memorable, beautiful project, but it was all about high tech. So in 1966, an architect, Cedric Price, he asked a really important question to our community. He said, if technology is the answer, what was the question? And what this question did, it provoked the field of design and the community to question the impact of technology and architecture on our cities, on our societies, and on our cultures. And today I feel like we're stuck 60 years later asking a really similar question, but it's about sustainability. And if sustainability is the answer, then what was the question? Because we keep on going up higher, and we keep on going out wider, and we keep on going deeper to extract. But to what end do we think sustainability is really going to save us or change the world in which we live if we don't systemically change the conditions by which we're thinking about progressing? And so we're seemingly drowning in this age of information while we're starving for wisdom. And this is a situation we find ourselves in that has been shaped by something called a mythology of technology, which I talk about in low tech. It was constructed 300 years ago by the intellectuals of the European Enlightenment. It was influenced by this confluence at the time of humanism and colonialism and racism. And this mythology has erased and ignored local wisdom and indigenous innovation, deeming it primitive for hundreds of years. And guiding this was this perception of technology that feasted on the felling of forest and the extraction of resources. And this particular mythology of technology, it powered the age of industrialization, and it distanced us from nature and natural systems because it favored fuel by fire. And today we see that this legacy has come back to haunt us. And while at the time there was only a sliver of all the technologies that existed at the time of the Enlightenment that were shepherded and valued through to the present. And meanwhile, an alternative mythology of technology, it's been with us since well before the Enlightenment. And that alternative mythology of technology really talks about working with nature and technologies that are symbiotic with natural systems. And so today we find ourselves really at this crossroad where we can either continue to view technology informed by our distance from nature, or we can acknowledge that the current dominant model of progress, especially within our profession, is just one way and not the only way for humans to live and to design in response to climate change. And if we're going to get serious about mitigating climate change, we really need to consider that the most effective way to do this is not by replicating a small number of high-tech and costly solutions developed by wealthy nations. But the most effective way to mitigate climate change is to recognize that a solution embedded in the traditional knowledge of a community and their environment that has been evolved through environmental extremes of that place is the most effective form of resilience at that scale. And so I want to go through a couple of different systems that were discussed in the book to give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So this is the Qanat system. It's an underground aqueduct of the Middle East, which passively cools buildings while moving aquifer water across really vast distances. And it does this by using wind towers. And this is a building called Ifugao, and it creates this evaporative cooler that works to store ice for the summer that's made in the winter through a process of wind from above and water channeled from below through the Qanat system. And so this is an illustration of the Qanat, and you can see it's this system that's actually underground, an aqueduct underground that's running through this cutaway section. It's been in use for 3,000 years, and it's meticulously designed, and it's a tunnel and channel system, and it was first developed by the Persians. It's now traveled all across the world. You can find many different names for the Qanat system. What they do is that they source, direct, and transport water underground from aqueducts, which are underground water resources, in the mountains, down to cities and down into agricultural lands. And they do this in really harsh environments that are arid, where evaporative cooling would make the water disappear very quickly if it was channeled along the water on the surface of the land. And the Qanat tunnels, they are up to several kilometers long. They have these vertical shafts, which is how you can tell where they're located when you're looking at the surface of the earth. And these vertical shafts that look like wells are sunk every 20 to 30 meters, snaking along the surface of the earth. You can see them here, leading towards this town. And so water conservation was obviously an incredibly high priority in these types of environments. But what was really amazing about the Qanat, which is very different to a well that's extractive, is that it releases water back into the aquifer at its end. So rather than constantly extracting, it's refilling as well. But it also can serve as integrating these into public spaces, really passive cooling technologies. A second system I wanted to show is the Altala of Medan in Iraq. And this is an islanding and housing system, which is really relevant when we see a lot of different discussions around the world about islanding technology. It's made from a single species of reed. They create the Altala islands and the Mudif houses, which you can see here. And they're designed and constructed by the Medan people of southern Iraq, so very close to the Qanat. And the Medan make these islands, you can see in the series of 4 illustrations to the left. They make them by fencing a living reed, then building up layers of reed and mud until they create a floating platform, and then creating these cathedral-like arched houses on top of these floating islands. And these particular houses, which are really distinct, they've actually been found in Sumerian Uruk imagery that dates back 6,500 years. So we know that this construction method has been used for that period of time. And the Kasab reed is integral to every aspect of life. Here you can see a video that a friend of mine took of a community of men actually creating one of the Mudif houses. But the reed that you can see here used, it's really important for every aspect of life. It's used for baking bread. It's used given to the cattle as fodder. It's really incredibly important for making these biodegradable building materials for the islands and for the houses. And these houses, which you can see being constructed, these columns which are going to be counterweighted to form the roof, they actually create these houses in 3 days. This is a house in construction with the archways after they've been completed. The Kasab reed is so versatile that you can see it's here bundled into columns, then bundled into smaller rafters. It's woven into walls, floors, and roofing systems, and then it's even twisted into ropes that bind the building, which you can see on these archways, because these buildings are designed and constructed without the use of any nails. So these are the Medan villages. They're still constructed in the marsh as they have been for generations. And these islands, they actually stay afloat for one generation, so about 25 years. A third example is the berry of the Bengalese in India. In other parts of the world where we see a lot of rivers that are contaminated with sewage, there's one Indian city of 15 million people that uses its floodplains to treat half of its wastewater. And it does this through this combination. You can see here the process of sunshine and sewage mixed with algae and bacteria. And through symbiosis, the wastewater that comes in about 95% water and 5% waste, it then gets broken down. And then these water continues from these pools into a series of fish ponds, where it continues to be broken down in a process that takes 30 days. And so on the edges of Calcutta, you can see there's buildings all around. There's a smoking escarpment of the city's trash. The system is ribboned by the city's highways. This indigenous technology of 300 fish ponds, it takes in sewage water, it cleans that water while producing the city's food. And this innovation, it's not just this model for chemical and coal power-free purification that provides also 100,000 jobs for the city's residents. Since Calcutta's core has no formal treatment system, it's actually the only way to clean the water downstream before it enters the Bay of Bengal. And the last example that I want to show you is this community. So living among the highest mountains of the Philippines and calling themselves sky people, the Ifugao are masters of terracing. And the terracing actually uses water and soil and rocks as its construction tools. And the Ifugao, they are known as the unrivaled rice terrace builders of the world. And they cultivate these slopes, which are initially up to 70 or 80 degree slopes, with these terraces that form these unique micro watersheds and serve as these rainwater filtration systems, amongst many other things. Because of the condition of the really steep mountainside, that actually, is an extreme condition that limits arable land and agricultural activity and practices. So to overcome this environmental extreme, the Ifugao transform these otherwise unusable hillsides into this incredibly productive and fertile land. And so through this combination of shallow water and high nutrient levels and very high primary productivity, which is what is formed by these micro watersheds, this whole system becomes this really ideal place for growing organisms that are at the base of the food chain. And so what happens is that not only do humans rely on this for food, many other species rely on this system for food, for water, and for shelter, especially during migration and breeding, making them actually really incredibly important to global biodiversity. And these types of terraces, they're now considered one of the world's most important ecosystems. They act as these massive absorption and purification systems, and also as nutrient and biodiversity storehouses. You can see that they have this really similar scale and steepness to our skyscrapers, and their biological performance, I think, really does have the potential to inform the integration of vertical landscaping into our urban environments. And it really hints at how the vertical environments could become havens for aquatic and terrestrial and airborne biodiversity, as well as urban agriculture. So this thinking, it's not new. And as designers, I really believe that our work is about having conversations with other designers from the past, from the present, from other disciplines, and having conversations with other people and bringing those ideas together. And so I do talk about that this work is really having a conversation with Bernard Radowski, whose seminal exhibition at MoMA called Architecture Without Architects is somewhat of an earlier extension that I speak to with the book. But also there's many other conversations that happened in the writing of the book, conversations with different Indigenous communities and different Indigenous leaders and people like the Zuni and Jimenote, who is the director of the Shiriawan Museum and Heritage Center, and Jassim Al-Assadi, who is director of the Nature Iraq organization. He actually was in an interview in the book. He provided all of the imagery and also the video that I showed you earlier of constructing the muddy of houses. I've worked with Jassim on projects before. He's an engineer and a scientist. He leads this Indigenous organization that is protecting the culture of the Madan people. And in the book, there are multiple different interviews with Indigenous scientists and designers talking about the specific systems in which they grew up and how these systems have evolved, how they're progressing, how they're being adapted and changed and updated into different types of contemporary uses. These conversations were conducted in Indigenous language first, published in Indigenous language first, and then published as an English translation after. Here you can see the English translation of Jassim's interview. So low tech suggests that our nature-based solutions to climate change, which is such an important topic that's being talked about at the moment, that they don't need to be passive conservation areas like forests. They can be areas that are very active, where people like the Khasi Hill tribe have evolved this amazing bridge innovation called the Living Root Bridge. Here, if you can see on screen, if you can locate the people, this is a double-decker living bridge. Our nature-based solutions, they can be active, they can be adaptive, they can be productive, and they can be complex coexistences of human and non-human species that use biodiversity as a building block for the future, like these living bridges that are created by guiding and growing tree roots over this bamboo scaffolding to grow to the opposite bank, where they're planted to form a structure that gets stronger with age. This is a finished living root bridge. So this is a 1,500-year-old tradition of growing these living root bridges and also ladders in India that has produced 75 different structures. And they take 50 years to grow, but in this landscape, they last for centuries. They're actually one of the only bridges that is feasible to build in this location that can withstand the force of the monsoon rains that come through this area, which is an area on the earth that has the highest rainfall. So climate change has shown us that our survival is not dependent upon superiority, but it's dependent upon symbiosis. Luis Margulis, a scientist, talks about this concept of survival of the symbiotic. And so shifting our thinking from survival of the fittest and that life is all about this competition to this idea that life is about sharing, which fundamentally is like how the human body is made up, how coral reef systems are made up. Really understanding that symbiosis is a critical way that life exists and that technology can exist is a really critical first step. And so I just want you to imagine how much we could learn from the thousands of years of nature-based technology and those cultures and communities that have evolved these technologies and settlements that we see presented here, and really what we could learn from all these ideas so that the mistakes that we've made in the past and the predicament that we find ourselves in the present won't be the only future that we see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Incredibly interesting look into some of the just really smart, straightforward and symbiotic ways that people can live in greater harmony with nature. To briefly introduce myself for the audience, my name is Harriet Winberg and I'm Executive Director of Ifugao, one of the organisations that's been very pleased to put on the Architecture of Place series, and really glad that, Julia, you could join us for this last session in the series. Whilst to give the audience some time just to get their questions maybe coming in on the Q&A feed, I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about your research process. So how did you go about gathering all the examples that did end up in the book? Did one sort of lead on to another and another? And maybe also how many volumes of low tech could there ultimately have been? I'm thinking you probably had to cut quite a lot.
So it began actually, as I mentioned, with the Bali project, which I was working on in 2012. And I worked with the government and worked with the Subic community for a year to evolve that conservation plan, but while doing that, realizing that this was an incredible technology and that there are many Subak scientists and people from Bali who are working with the community trying to evolve different technologies through different planting regimes and watering regimes, and to sort of undo some of the damage that had been done by the past destructive practices. And then I went on through a similar person from that project to another project to work with the Madan people and to work with Jalsim Al-Asadi, who I mentioned I'd interviewed, and he was a really incredible person in the research. And so it all began by working with different communities. At the same time, while I was teaching technology, I started to introduce these research projects of looking at different communities and their technologies as part of the seminar that I was teaching. And different students from around the world would choose a technology from where they had come from and research that technology and present that work. And so we started to build up this big lexicon of case studies that were really students talking about their indigenous technologies from the countries they'd come from. And then multiple different projects occurred and different travels, and went and visited different communities, and was led through, a series of sort of evolutions of being introduced to different people. And then the whole sort of book evolved. And there are actually 35 case studies, and some of them we didn't progress for different reasons. Sometimes we couldn't find community members to speak about those technologies. There's always a diversity of reasons about how and why the knowledge can be presented. And so
very good. Yes, yeah, we can look forward to those. Just also thinking, you must now, because you've been speaking about this project kind of far and wide, but largely online, I think, given the year that we've just had, which maybe hasn't been a bad thing if you find you've been able to reach more audiences and further flung corners of the world with the project, with so much happening online.
Yeah, it's actually been really incredible. I've spoken at conferences in Africa with different organizations, with the UNCTCN, that look specifically at these types of technologies. I've had people from South America who are working with different communities email me with images of the book, and then images that have been drawn by different people in communities showing the systems that they use that are similar to case studies in the book. And I know that the book is sort of being used as a bit of a tool and a communication tool and a communication platform. So I think it has been really fortuitous going online and having the availability that's not limited to just traveling to all these specific locations to speak and present the work.
Yes, yeah, no, and saving on the carbon as well. Yeah. Good thing. I think we're going to have a few questions probably, how people can get into this sort of work.
Initially, low tech is really different. It's about really understanding your ecosystems and looking for technologies that are in place in your ecosystems and thinking about how those ideas can be applied to design and to climate resilient thinking. What I've seen in the profession for many years is that there are teams that travel to different locations around the world talking about climate change and climate resilient technologies and how to design them. And often they're taking knowledge about their place and they're telling another place to apply that knowledge. And inadvertently, it's sort of repeating this cycle of erasure, and this proponent for this can be somewhat considered this sort of neo-colonial approach to climate change and climate resilience that we're seeing occurring. And so I think as designers, we need to be, first of all, aware of that. I don't think that it's something that's often talked about. And I think we need to understand that, in contemporary design, there's so much discussion, so much research, and that has been put into sort of, Polderdijk systems, but a very specific Polderdijk system, usually a Dutch version, that is talked about in terms of climate change and, resistance to sea level rise. But if I go to India, I find a Polderdijk system there that's in the north that's different to a Polderdijk system in the south. Or if I go to China, I find a Polderdijk system that is good for, resisting flooding and sea level rise. And you can find these types of systems all over the world. And what we're not recognizing as designers is that there's types of systems, but then there's very specific indigenous technologies in the locations that we are designing, and that we should be the proponents for talking about the importance of those specific indigenous technologies. And we should be also the people who are saying, we need to talk to Indigenous communities. We need to talk to local communities. We need to understand these types of systems and understand how our thinking can be changed by these types of systems. Not a case of how do we take this and how do we reapply it in a contemporary city? It's really a case of, being this critical role and this agent of change to say we need to think differently. We need to think differently about technology. We don't need to be that profession that keeps on professing this mythology of technology that is about contemporary and high tech. We need to be that profession that can actually change the conversation and talk about climate resilience and design in a very different way. And we can lift up local communities and bring them to the table and include them in the conversations that are really relevant, so that we're talking about climate change and we're pushing a path forward that is in alliance and next to Indigenous communities that really do hold this knowledge and this technology and the understanding of resilience in the landscape.
Actually, a few questions. I think we can maybe link two of them together. So one sort of asking how extremely climate change is maybe affecting some of the Indigenous practices and methods that are around the world. And you mentioned that in your talk, that it is affecting it. And then another that's asking whether some methods that are in one part of the world could possibly be implemented in another part of the world, and whether you're seeing some scope for, places where climates are changing, that some practices that maybe wouldn't have been relevant there could begin to be relevant in another part of the world.
One of the locations where we're seeing practices are in one part of the world could be applied, and this is sort of theoretically something that's talked about when discussing traditional ecological knowledge, but it's applied in that a system from one biome, like a wetland ecosystem, it could be applied to another wetland ecosystem. What we see happening with climate change, and especially in places that are very cold, their temperatures are warming, is that you see an Arctic condition changing to a more temperate condition. And so different types of technologies could and are being asked to be invariably applied. What can we do when we're seeing our types of desert landscapes change to a grassland landscape? What types of technologies could assist us with these changes? And so that's a really, really important question. And especially as well, like I mentioned at the very beginning with the wildfires, there's now, especially with that particular group, the Fire Stick Alliance, there's knowledge sharing around the globe where people are talking about cultural burning practices from Australia, how they can inform cultural burning practices in other parts of the world that perhaps this knowledge hasn't been retained, or there's more specific types of knowledge that are being talked about, how that can be shared globally to combat this phenomenon that we see happening on a global scale. And for, climate change and these practices, how they're affected, I think what's really interesting is, if we read sort of the IPCC, 2019 report, and we see what's being listed as ways to deal with climate change solutions, they're generally talked about in 4 categories. They're talked about as fortifying, surrendering, defensive, and offensive. And really what we're talking about, in fortification is the most often talked about, fortifying to resist sea level rise or flooding or inundation. And that's the only category in that IPCC report that actually talks about Indigenous solutions. All the other categories are not addressing Indigenous solutions as part of the solution base by which we can use. What the Indigenous solutions are incredible at is dealing with environmentally adaptive and fluid events and conditions. So living with water, allowing water in, and dealing with incredibly big fluctuations of water tidal conditions, or building land in different ways at just hard surfaces. So building up defensive strategies. And so there are so many different technologies that, yes, they're impacted by climate change, but they adapt themselves over time, and they have been adapting. So they already have that incredibly resilient, sustainable thinking because they're born out of those conditions. And so they have that ability to keep on evolving. And so that's kind of what we're seeing in these locations. So I think that there's just so much need for us, while we're talking about climate change solutions, and while we're actually starting to really give a lot of money and funding to climate change solutions, to address the fact that this funding shouldn't just be going to conservation foundations. that have climate change solutions that are passive, this funding should be going to local communities who have very active climate change technologies that could be scaled with assistance, with sustainable business models. And that is going to be the way that we address climate change globally and really equitably.
On a slightly different subject, we've got a question about the role of archaeology in putting together low tech, so in the research that you did, whether that did come into it. So were any of the practices that that got included in this volume of low tech, are they all still extant, still practiced? I know some of them are certainly endangered, or did archaeology have to come into it, looking at things that used to be done?
No, there wasn't really any archaeology that came into it. All these practices are still in existence and still practiced, sometimes in a very, very minimal form. Some of the practices, they're used, but they're not actively managed. There's systems that have replaced them. But in a lot of cases, it's recognized that these systems have a huge opportunity for a resurgence and being brought back into the built environment and common way that technologies are being reintegrated back to deal with changing conditions.
And another question, Julia, I hope you and I might actually be here all night with the number of questions that are coming in now to get through all of them. But so you mentioned some of the dialogues that you're having with the projects, looking back to things like Architecture Without Architects, that exhibition at MoMA, and other practitioners, other authors who've put together similar projects in the past. Just this question of whether we sort of suffer from cultural amnesia almost, that we come to these points of recognizing, oh, this is something really important, we should think about it, and then we drift and forget, and then it takes low tech or its equivalent to come to try to call people's attention to it again. What do you want to do next with low tech, maybe to make sure that this continues to stay front of the agenda?
I don't know if we have a cultural amnesia. I think that there's a purpose that we need to keep on going back to ideas. And as I say, it's a building of a conversation. And, these types of conversations, they're not front and center of architectural design, and they never have been. And that they seem to, I think, in the cultural environmental context of today, now they're being recognized as front and center, and that they're incredibly important and they're incredibly relevant. And the future of low tech, that's a future that's not really for me to decide. Low tech is a platform to begin what I thought was a really relevant conversation that I couldn't find out there. But that conversation, I think, is most relevantly going to be continued when we start recognizing there another way to think about technology, and that recognizing that Indigenous communities and different leaders and scientists and designers from those communities, they need to be the people that we're listening to. And so I think that it's not going to be low tech, or it's not going to be me. I think the hope and the dream would be that, this is a point where we come to a lot of social and environmental reckoning and recognition, and that this type of thinking is now led by Indigenous community members and Indigenous designers, and that there's an incredible allyship that's evolved between the design community and those leaders, that we can work together and knowledge will be shared, and that there'll be creation of some type of a new period where design thinks in a different way. And I've had the opportunity to speak to a lot of Indigenous people since publishing Low Tech. And it's really interesting because, number one, they all say, yeah, this is innovation. Really great that you recognize that. We've known this forever. And number two, that there seems to be this incredible renaissance happening, this recognition of Indigenous ways of thinking and design and technology. And the hope is that that wave will just keep on building and getting far stronger and start to really lead us into a new direction about nature-based thinking, nature-based culture, and really start to shift the environmental movement to give that movement an identity about nature-based culture and nature-based thinking.
And thinking how that positive change can come from lots of small initiatives that are happening. We've got one comment that's come in just mentioning that UK water companies using reed beds for sewage treatment. And certainly whether having put together low tech and now talking about it, sort of lecturing about it, have you been encouraged by becoming more mainstream solutions in other parts of the world like that?
Yeah, and I mean, solutions that are both in cities and solutions that are, both in some of the locations that I've talked about, like the Medan. There's an incredible project that I began working on that's been progressed about similar types of wastewater treatment reed bed systems that are then treating water coming out of cities that are going back into the marshlands, that are going to be treating water all up the Nile. I mean, I'm also really excited by some of the stuff that I see coming out of Europe when people are looking at the idea of symbiosis being integrated into industrial processes. So that idea of circularity and symbiosis now starting to sort of influence the way that cities and districts are being designed to be able to be symbiotic in these different ways that have never been conceived before. So I think that once we start to look for these types of ideas, you can start to see them on very different scales in lots of different allied fields outside of design as well.
In your response then, we've got a specific question about it, wondering how the Medan fare in extreme weather conditions. Anything more you can add on that?
The Medan, the biggest issue with the Medan is that that 6,500-year-old system was actually drained by Saddam Hussein. And so that there are 500,000 people that were living in those wetlands in that traditional manner, and that Saddam Hussein drained it and all these people were displaced. The biggest issue now is that there has been a big push towards revitalizing that wetland ecosystem and bringing back the Medan people into that ecosystem. About 10,000 people have returned now to live in that ecosystem. But in the meantime, in the last 20 years, the water has changed from the Nile. The salination has increased. Irrigation has taken a lot of initial water that was available from that system. So now they're dealing with all these different environmental extremes. So none of these are like easy fixes. They're very complex. And now, these systems, once they're sort of influenced and erased in the way that the Medan ecosystem was erased by Hussein, they don't go back to what they were before. And I think, that's kind of pointing to like a larger discussion, is that I'm not talking about going back to some type of different way of living, or that the Medan are going to go back to living how they were living 40, 30 years ago. But we're talking about a way that we can move forward and keep on evolving, but in a different way to the way we're conceiving of now. And so that our built environment and of technology is going to take a different course to the way we've seen it progress until this point in time.
And actually, leading off of that, a few questions coming in that we've lost the ability to think and to behave in cycles. So a lot of the traditional ecological knowledge that you've been speaking about that have had cycles that would have had, nature in mind, obviously the seasons, the passage of time, and would have included a certain amount of maintenance and repair just as natural ongoing, mentioning that the motifs float for a generation. So, you've got that sort of life cycle inbuilt. Thinking about how to have the traditional ecological knowledge more sort of into practice and seeing how it can be implemented kind of in different ways. Do you see a slight jarring with the really cyclical way of doing things that entails with some of the possibly slightly more linear kind of policy making, more government mandates that would come to be governing how things tend to be done with agriculture and otherwise?
Yeah, big question.
I've just merged about
felt like I think it's interesting when we say we've forgotten. There's an idea that there's a conclusive we, and I don't think that there is. And I think that's sort of what low-tech talks about, that there isn't a conclusive we. There are so many different ways to think about how humans exist with nature in so many different forms, and that's what the book is really exploring. And that happens on a gradient from people who live within these cycles and these seasonal understandings. And it's very interesting to see how those cycles and seasonal understandings are remembered. In the book, I talk about mythology and ceremony. It's talked about as a way that we remember to remember. So we have these different things that are memorialized at different times throughout the year, and a different set of practices associated with those things that we memorialize, so that at that point in time, you remember to memorialize, but then you remember the things that you're supposed to be memorializing, and that's technology, and that's about your environment and environmental understandings, and that's practices. And in varied forms, we have that in different ways. And yes, it would be fantastic if we could start to think in those ways and start to think in those cycles. But then we have this other huge cycle that I talk about in the dedication of the book, which is to the next 7 generations. So we have cyclical cycles, and then we have really long cycles, which we talk about is referred to as deep time. So 7 generations is 150 years or so, or longer. And that is something that we talk about as deep time practices that are evolved under these types of long conditions. And so, yes, we need to start thinking about short-term cyclical practices. We need to also start thinking about super long-term understandings and planning for futures that aren't like next year or, Q1, Q2. We seem to have this incredible short-sightedness. We have that because of governments and how long governments are in place, but we also, have that because we base so much on sort of economic life cycles, and that has gotten us to a certain point. And I think that there is already, there's big recognition and questioning about how far that will get us into the future, that there are other conditions that need to be brought to the forefront and considered that will bear upon the survival of us and the survival of the planet that are far more important.
It's impressive. That was definitely 6 answers rolled into one for the questions. Thank you, Julia. I think we have time for 2 more. So one, I think we've got, again, a couple of questions that are asking, if somebody is living in, say, a suburb of London as a city springing to mind, what from low tech, was there something that you came across that's in the book or that you found sort of through conversations with other people, something that could be adopted into that person's life that would bring low tech kind of to them in that context?
Yeah, I mean, I get this question all the time about what technology from where I live can be applied. And I'm like, well, I don't know that I've been to where you live, nor I've researched where you, but like, I do know that in London, if we want to talk about technology, there used to be walled citrus groves. And that was a means by which to sort of extend the seasonal cycle of different fruit trees that would be enabled in a more Mediterranean environment that could live in environments that they weren't endemic to. And it's something that we see in much northern regions as well. And, we see it also used to be in Israel, where there would be walled environments where you could grow different Mediterranean fruits. So if you're thinking about something interesting in London, that might be something that you would apply. But I think, there's so many ways that we can start to think about how do we take these ideas and how do we embed them into our daily life cycle. And I do want to say that I deal with the built environment. I really am talking about infrastructures, and I really do believe that the scale of the individual, you have decisions to make, but the scale of huge impact is at the scale of infrastructure. So the individual, you have decisions. You can decide who you support in your government. You can decide who speaks for you in terms of making decisions about your built environment, about the future of your cities and the future of your families and your life. So all these decisions that you make at like the individual level about recycling or where you spend your money, etc., that's really important. But I really do feel that the scale of infrastructure and the scale of, corporations, that's the scale that we have to hit, and that's the scale that really needs to be addressed. And the government needs to be the proponent of that, and the government gets empowered by if you vote for them. And so that's a really, really important issue for everybody.
And circling back to your point about fruit, which has nothing to do with government, speaking as somebody I've eaten pineapple that was grown in Scotland, so it is possible still today. Yeah. Absolutely right. So a last question, Julia. So high tech and low tech, are they nemesis? Can they get along? What do you think?
I mean, you can look at high tech often being evolved from low tech. They're definitely not nemesis. Like, I'm a huge proponent that if we're going to do anything, if we're going to have any impact upon our future, we need all these solutions. What low tech is saying is that there have been thousands of solutions and thousands more that have been erased, but there are thousands in existence that have never even been considered. And there are a whole slew of reasons, and most of them are really terrible. Cultural genocide and erasure of communities. There's reasons why this has happened. There's a mythology of technology, and it's about that high tech is the only way to think. And that's not the case, because we see communities all over the world who have these incredible technologies, and we need to question, the efficacy that we're always proposing that high tech is the way to deal with the problems, and therefore the global north will be ultimately the most resilient. But that's not the case, and that's not the discussion, and that's not the narrative that we should be progressing. There's a narrative that there are technologies from the global south that are in existence, that are incredibly resilient, that can be as impactful as high tech, and that we need to balance the way that we're viewing climate change, and that we need to start addressing and understanding that there's a whole new narrative that we can construct that'll help us deal with climate change and to create an alternative future.
Wonderful words, and a perfect note probably on which to bring this session maybe to a close. So for me, it just remains to say thank you very, very much, Julia, for speaking to us. Edith Platten, Director of Education at the ICAA, to conclude.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harriet, and thank you so much, Julia. That was absolutely fascinating. And thanks to both you and Harriet for that thought-provoking discussion. Thank you all for tuning in today, and I hope you all have a happy and safe holiday season. Thanks again, Julia. Thanks, Harriet.